Talks are continuing in Cairo, aimed at reaching a ceasefire in Gaza. The framework proposal would see female, sick, and elderly captives released in exchange for a 6-week truce. The U.S. Vice President has voiced what she calls deep concern about Gaza and urged Israel to do more to increase the flow of humanitarian aid. Kamala Harris has had talks in Washington with Israeli War Cabinet member Benny Gantz. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reportedly told Israeli embassy staff in Washington not to help Gantz with his visit. Shihab Ratansi has more from the U.S. Capitol.
Despite the reported objections of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Benny Gantz is being received almost at the highest levels of the Biden administration, not President Biden himself, but the Vice President, and a selection of the key decision makers for foreign policy in the administration. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and National Security Council Middle East Coordinator Brett McGurk on Monday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken at the State Department on Tuesday. The White House says that Gantz requested the meeting, and it made sense to meet him, given he is a core part of the three-man war cabinet. In the readout of their meeting, Vice President Kamala Harris says she expressed her deep concern about the humanitarian conditions in Gaza and the recent horrific tragedy around an aid convoy in northern Gaza. She called on Hamas to accept the terms on the table for the 6-week ceasefire and enable a surge of humanitarian assistance throughout Gaza. They discussed the situation in Rafah and the need for credible and implementable humanitarian plans prior to any military operation there. And she urged Israel, according to the readout, to take additional measures in cooperation with the United States and international partners to increase the flow of humanitarian assistance into Gaza. Shihab Ratansi, Al Jazeera, Washington.
We'll now speak to Gideon Levy, who's a political analyst and contributor for the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, joining us from Tel Aviv. Thanks for your time with us on Al Jazeera. So how do you read Gantz's trips to Washington, D.C., and then he goes on to the U.K. to hold meetings there?
It's first of all, like usually in Israel, it's all about domestic politics. It is not so important as people tend to think, because finally, Mr. Gantz has very little influence on the government in questions of continuing the war or not continuing the war. Netanyahu is the one and the only one who decides right now. The Americans are playing a typical American game in which they gave a cold shoulder to Netanyahu a long time ago, and Gantz is their white hope. Gantz is doing very well in the polls, and he has the best chances to be next prime minister if and when there will be elections in Israel. But meanwhile, Netanyahu is the prime minister if we like it or if we don't. I think that Gantz gains out of it, obviously, domestically, because Israel sees him as an alternative. But nothing will be decided in those meetings.
So what you're saying is that you don't see how this is going to impact any potential ceasefire talks that are taking place in Egypt right now, as well as the trajectory of the war, because Gantz just doesn't have the leverage in Israel?
Absolutely. That's exactly the picture. And who has the leverage doesn't use it, namely the United States, because they are holding the strongest leverage over Israel, not only for a ceasefire, for a final ending of the war, but until now, the United States refused to use this leverage.
We know, according to reporting coming out of Israel, that, of course, there are divisions amongst the war cabinet members as well as the government on the war. We know as well that Netanyahu instructed the Washington staff, his Washington staff in the U.S. not to sort of facilitate Gantz's trip. How are these differences and divisions that are taking place impacting the continuation of the war?
First of all those differences that you named are real, but there is one thing which doesn't exist. Nobody in the cabinet wants to put a final ending to this war now. None of them, even not Mr. Gantz. There are those who would like to be more flexible in any kind of deal for a ceasefire, for a pause, obviously releasing the hostages. Netanyahu, we don't know because he's playing with all the cards right now, but I guess he's more hawkish. But by the end of the day, don't be wrong, nobody in Israeli government wants to put an end to the war now, which is the only thing which is needed right now.
So talk to us about where those differences stem from and how unprecedented is this amongst the Israeli government?
First of all, it's not unprecedented. We had unity governments in the past. I can recall only one of them when Shimon Peres was the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Yitzhak Shamir was Prime Minister, and Peres tried to get to an agreement with King Hussein behind the back of the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister just put an end to it immediately. Those things happen in a coalition government, in a wider government. And by the end of the day, Netanyahu is still the most powerful figure in Israeli politics. We cannot deny it, and the Americans know it. The fact that they are trying to make this division is very nice, but it's not very effective. They will not reach much through guns. They can only really increase his domestic power, which is also something to look forward, but that's not enough to change the war. Right now, the cabinet is divided over how flexible Israel should be, but again, only about a pause, only about the hostages deal, not about ending the war.
Okay, thank you so much, Gideon Levy, for speaking to us from Tel Aviv.